Hello and welcome. This webinar is part of the Fundraising from Grantmakers Toolkit, in which we will be exploring how to measure and demonstrate change. So we're going to make a couple of assumptions, one of those being that you will already have started working through this toolkit, and this is just part of your wider learning in this area. So learning outcomes, you should be going away from this webinar with a better understanding of the terminology surrounding measuring and demonstrating change, a better understanding of why you need to measure your work, a better understanding of what to measure and then how you can communicate that change affected by your work. So let's look at some of the jargon we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. All things that you are going to need when you are writing a funding application. So it's important to understand that this webinar is a really simple look at some of the terminology. So we're going to be starting with activities. So in the context of what we're talking about in this webinar, activities are the practical things that you need to do to make your project or work happen. So for example, staff time to plan, staff time to host meetings, staff time to write resources. Outputs are the next bit of the process. So outputs are the number of volume of things that happen as a short-term result of the activities you've done. So actually it could be that you held 5 meetings. It could be that 25 people attended. It could be that the activities around creating resources means that there were 5 resources published. So outputs measure, they don't really address change or value. So it's important to make those distinctions between what we're talking about today. So then we come to outcomes, which really simply are the changes that will happen as a result of your work. So actually, if you are running 5 consultation events and including people in project design, more LGBT people are going to feel included in your group, or LGBT people are going to have better access to support. It could be that one of the outcomes of your work is that there is an increase in hate crime reporting, which feels counterintuitive when you're trying to combat hate crime, but actually you are putting things in place through your activities and your outputs that mean that it's easier for people to report hate crime when it is going on. So actually that is a successful outcome. So there are also things called soft outcomes and journeys travelled, which relate to the things that are not so tangible to measure or put a value on. They could be more about happiness levels or confidence levels. So right here I have a very, very simple example just to put some of this in context. So my pretend group here is a small LGBT plus group, and they have identified that actually bisexual women aren't really using their support service, and they want to apply for a short project for a small piece of funding that will seek to engage them better. So the activity around this is that their staff will develop a plan to run a series of events to consult bi women on how they use their services, or not in this case, and what they can do differently to encourage them to do that. So as a result of that activity, the output is that 25 women attend 2 different events. And the longer term outcomes could have been that bi women report that they feel more represented in service design or in the group itself. It could be that more bi women have access to support, and now they're reporting an increase in positive mental health. So the activity is what you're doing, the output is the result of that activity, and then the outcome is the change that you've brought about through that work. So it's really important when setting your outcomes that they are realistic and achievable, because you've got to measure your work against them. So I've made up another group here. So there's an LGBT plus group delivering training to teachers to enable them to identify and tackle homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying in schools. So here's an example of an unrealistic, albeit aspirational outcome to work towards. No one ever experiences HBT bullying again, ever. So, again, aspirational, but really, really hard to achieve in the space of a project for sure. So I've put some more maybe realistic and achievable outcomes below. So one outcome could be that there is an increase in HBT bullying because actually young LGBT people are recognising HBT bullying and are not afraid to report it. Another outcome could be that young LGBT people feel more confident in being out at schools. Another one could be that young LGBT people have better access to support from teachers. And another one could be that actually through the work, more teachers are able to feel out, which offers a real clear role model to young LGBT people. So all of those things are a bit more measurable and they're a bit more achievable. And it's important to have both of those things when setting your outcomes in mind. So I talked a little bit about measuring your work against your outcomes to show that you've achieved them. So I'm just going to have a little look at that in a bit more detail. So there's a common misconception that only big charities with big bank accounts can afford to measure their work and demonstrate their impact, because small charities can measure results too really effectively. It's important to be able to show that your work, your interventions are affecting change, that you're meeting a need, and this is going to help you attract funding, improve your own work, and also show the communities that you're working in that you're really having an impact. So before you decide how you're going to measure or what you're going to measure, it's important to ask yourself and your colleagues in your group a few questions. So why do you want to measure the results or measure your work? It shouldn't just be because you think you should. You need to look at what you're going to use that information for. Is it funding bids? Is it to show that your communities that you are working effectively? What's the reason for you doing it? Who are you doing it for? So again, if it's for a funder, the information that you produce might be quite different than if you were just showing the community and your service users how well you were doing. How will you do it? So you really, really need to think about how you're going to collect information that shows that you're successful. When will you do it? Are you going to do it once? Are you going to do it throughout the project that you're running? Are you going to do it right at the beginning and then at the end? You need to think that through before you kind of plan what you're going to ask. And what will you do once you have it? So will you just give it to a funder? Will you produce it into some kind of impact report? Think about all of these things before you decide on what you're going to do. And once you've kind of had a proper think about that, you kind of need to think about what you're actually measuring. So numbers can be great, but actually numbers aren't everything. If you are telling me that you've worked with 45 LGBT people, that's great, but I don't know what you've done with them. I don't know what changes you've made in their lives. I don't know what support you've offered. So it's not enough to just count. You need to do more than that. You can measure people's satisfaction levels, their confidence levels. You can do that in simple kind of surveys at the beginning of something and then at the end of it. You can do that through informal conversations or online surveys, whichever you prefer. You can measure whether people have increased access. You can measure whether people feel more included. You can look at who is accessing your service. Is there an increase in diversity? Are different types of people, different ages, different genders now accessing your service as a result of your work? You can measure things like increased level of health, increased levels of well-being, decrease in incident or an increase in an incident where it comes to reporting. And there's loads of different ways in which you can do it. You can simply count. You can give people surveys. You can give them online questionnaires. You can use observations. You can use loads of different online tools. There's loads of free and paid for tools that can help you measure your outcomes. There's also narratives. So actually, if somebody is in distress when they come to you for support, the last thing they're going to want you to do is shove a questionnaire in their face about how well their mental health is. So actually, if you can build it into some narrative and be thinking about how can I get some information that will help me to measure this, that can be really useful. And a mixture of quantitative and qualitative. So actually, it's great to have stats and numbers and volume, but actually getting those human stories, getting that narrative is really, really important too. And when you are collecting people's kind of opinion or getting them to rate confidence or health or well-being, it's really quite a good idea to ask them to attribute how they think those changes have come about. Because actually, if they're saying it's 100% because of the support they've received from you, that's a really powerful thing to know. But actually, if they're telling you that it's part of a suite of services that they have got from you and 5 other organisations, it doesn't make it any less powerful, but it's really useful information to have, because you can really show where your particular support or service is having an impact on that person's journey, if you like. Okay, now we're going to look at what you do with that information. So Going back to a couple of slides before where we talked about thinking about who is this information for? Is it just for the funder? Is it for the community? So you really need to think about that, because there's no point in monitoring absolutely every possible thing and ending up with reams of data that you don't know what to do with or who you should be showing what. So it's good to be quite focused about what you monitor and measure. People don't want to be inundated with questionnaires and surveys, so you need to get it right the first time, and you need to make it meaningful. Find out what other groups are doing, what do they use, how do they collect data, learn from them. Try and test. Again, you don't want to get this wrong, you want to get it right first time. You're not going to get another chance to collect a sort of baseline data from people once they've accessed your support. So try it and test it. If it doesn't work, change it. Don't be afraid to change it and try different things. Again, talking to other groups at one of our conferences or through our networks can be really, really useful. So you can use some of that data that you've collected, make it visual, make it interesting for other people. You can be using it as a kind of, hey, look at the great work we're doing, fund us, support us. Don't blind funders with stats, or at least if you're going to use stats, which are quite powerful, fluff them up with stories that go with them. So remember that human narrative that goes alongside that kind of raw data. And keep in mind your outcomes all the time. The data you collect should be used to demonstrate that you have affected the change that you set out to make. So don't be collecting superfluous data that you just aren't going to need, that isn't going to be part of, yes, we did this and this is how we did it. So I whipped up a little example here from that LGBT group that wanted to be more inclusive of bi women. So this is some potential information that we could produce with some of the data that we've collected. So we're going to say here 99% of people reported improved well-being, and 80% of those people attributed that improvement specifically to support received from that LGBT group. 40% of people will go on to access further support from us. That's really good, because it's showing that actually there's a commitment to continue supporting those people, that it wasn't just a, oh, we got funded to do this and now that's all we're doing. And then we've also zhuzhed this up with a bit of narrative at the end. So June reported that when she joined the project, she had no friends and very little confidence. June attended our support meetings for 6 months and now reports that she feels happier and well connected within her local community. She will actually start volunteering as a befriender with us in the spring. Now that's a real added bonus. That wasn't in anybody's outcomes. Nobody was looking at kind of improving meaningful occupation or learning new skills, but actually that's something that's come about, and it really shows that you have added value to what you originally set out to do. So here's my little do's and don'ts list. So don't just list your outputs. So don't just stick to numbers of what you produced. So 10 events, 20 people. Don't just use stats. It's fine if you want to, and they can be really powerful, but remember to zhuzh them up with a bit of narrative. Don't panic. Don't forget what variables can affect your data. So actually that's about that attribution. Service users might be accessing other support that has an impact. So if you can ask questions about where they feel that support had the most impact, that can be really useful. Do tell a story. Remember, people are human. Relate information back to the overarching goals of your organisation. Make it interesting, be innovative, make it readable. We, in our annual insight reports, actually always create a short visual report for people to read. And do attribute success. So actually, if you know that someone's had an amazing journey and is really, really reporting increased well-being, and you're the only service they have accessed, then that means that the change in their life is attributed to your service. And that's a really, really powerful thing to kind of report back on. So as part of this toolkit, I'm going to ask you to do a bit of work. I'm going to say get together with your committee, your trustees or your colleagues and discuss the following things. Are we measuring our work, not just counting numbers? Why do we want to measure? What should we measure? How should we measure it? How are we going to resource it? And then make a plan for how you monitor your work. So for further support around this topic, you can get in touch with any of our engagement team on the address showing on the screen, which is admin@lgbtconsortium.org.uk. And as part of our skills development and training programme, we're also working with a partner to deliver one-day training around outcomes specifically. So if you're interested in that, do get in touch with us and we can arrange for you to attend one of those sessions.